In continuation to the foreign body discussion which was done regarding the button battery ingestion, we have another question with the foreign body aspiration this time. So this is an 8-month-old infant who accidentally ingests a marble and is brought to the ED immediately. The child appears cyanosed. There is no sound of crying, and you immediately open the airway, but foreign body isn't visible. The central pulse is palpable. How do you proceed further? Okay, so in the patient with complete foreign body airway occlusion, especially if it is a child, depends whether the child is responsive or not. If the child is responsive, you go ahead and do. This is for an infant, not for a child, but for an infant which is less than 1 year of age. If the infant is responsive, you give alternating back thrust and chest compressions. If the infant is non-responsive, you go ahead and give chest compressions, like in BLS scenario of cardiac arrest. Okay. So the answer would be to start chest compressions alternating with the back thrusts. Let's see the other options as well. The foreign body is in the airway, hence you use Megile's forceps to remove the foreign body. This is absolutely wrong. You should never do this. Rather, it was previously recommended to open the airway and to do a blind finger sweep initially, but this is no longer recommended now. Okay, you need to attempt removing a foreign body only if you can see it while you are opening the airway. Otherwise, blind finger sweeping is not recommended. No forceps is ever recommended if in such a scenario of a complete foreign body airway occlusion. Okay, you start giving abdominal thrusts. Abdominal thrust is Heimlich's maneuver, and this is used for adults or children. But since we have an infant with us, we would prefer back thrust and compression alternatively rather than abdominal thrust. Okay, so this is not the correct answer again. You put the child on high flow oxygen by face mask and call the ENT surgeon immediately. No, this is again wrong. Every emergency provider should have the skills to perform BLS and ACLS care. Okay, and this is a BLS scenario, and this should be done by the person immediately in the emergency department only, and should not wait for an ENT consultant. Okay, so after this, come to the next question again. This is a 52-year-old woman who presents to the emergency room 5 hours after eating a seafood at a seafood restaurant while on vacation in Hawaii. She has abdominal cramps, nausea, vomiting, and watery diarrhea. Also complains of tingling and numbness of her lips and extremities. Physical examination reveals fine tremor and some mild ataxia, which is the most likely diagnosis. Okay, so as we have discussed in one of the previous questions, after eating food, the patient had skin rash, eating some medication. Patient had skin rash, shock, and respiratory complaints. Right, and we had diagnosed as anaphylaxis. So we should always consider anaphylaxis in all the events presenting after ingestion of some food or medication. So does this patient qualify for the diagnosis of anaphylaxis? Okay, so there was a seafood, so there could be a possible allergen, that is one. GI symptoms are present in the form of abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting and diarrhea. But there is no respiratory symptom, there is no cardiovascular symptom. Okay, so only one system is involved and other systems are not involved at all. So this does not qualify for diagnosis of anaphylaxis. So we can safely rule out anaphylaxis here. But this patient also has typical other findings as well: tingling and numbness of lips and extremities, fine tremor and mild ataxia. This is typical for ciguatera poisoning. Okay, this is not a common thing at all. This is mostly of an academic importance, not seen practically. I have not seen any case of ciguatera poisoning as such. But since it has a very classical clinical feature, usually it is caused by eating a reef fish, and the toxin responsible is the ciguatoxin. This leads to GI symptoms like diarrhea and vomiting, which the patient had. There are also, in addition, the CNS features like which are suggestive of cerebellar dysfunction in the form of ataxia, vertigo. Now, something which is typically seen is cold, hot sensation reversal. Some patients may also have cold allodynia. These are typical features which are seen in patients with ciguatera poisoning. There is no definitive treatment as such. Some treatments like mannitol, like amitriptyline have been recommended, but there is no definitive treatment for ciguatera poisoning. It's in a self-limiting condition. Okay, what is scromboid poisoning? Scromboid poisoning again is caused by eating seafood, caused by eating fish which has been spoiled, and leads to clinical features like flushed skin, watery diarrhea, cramps, and headaches, etc. The typical feature is a flushed skin, and there could be a generalized erythema. So as you can see, skin is involved and the GI system is involved. This could mimic anaphylaxis. But the typical skin finding in anaphylaxis is an articular rash, which is not seen in patients with scromboid poisoning. It's usually seen as a generalized erythematous rash without much itching. Okay, this is again a very rare thing to see, but it's an important, an exciting and a rare condition of mostly academic importance. Okay, so you should know what is scromboid poisoning, and you should know what is ciguatera poisoning, as the questions may be asked on this as well. Okay, now we come to the next question, switching from GI tract and acute gastroenteritis like pictures to the CNS. Which of the following is an indication for urgent neuroimaging? Okay, we consider it by option to option. Complain of a headache after getting a lumbar puncture done. This is post lumbar puncture headache. This is a benign condition, does not need much evaluation, so there is no need for a neuroimaging. So this is not correct. A cluster headache in a patient with prior history of the same. Cluster headache is a kind of a primary headache disorder which does not have any organic basis on evaluation, and since the patient has a prior history of a similar complaint, an acute attack would be considered a precipitation of the same, hence does not require further evaluation again if he has been evaluated previously. A new headache with an in an HIV positive male, yes, this is an indication, and we'll discuss why. Okay, come to the next option. Fever, headache, vomiting and photophobia in a conscious female. Okay, so this combination looks like meningitis to me. Okay, this is a typical presentation of fever, headache and photophobia along with vomiting. If it is there, one should consider meningitis in upfront. Now you may wonder if this is a suspected meningitis. We usually do a CT scan followed by a lumbar puncture. So this also becomes an urgent indication for neuroimaging. So now let's discuss these two concepts one by one. First of all, headache. Okay, so there are some red flag sign in headache. Rather, we can include these into a single concept of when to do a CT scan head in ED. Okay, so it is recommended, as correctly you guys know, that for meningitis, definitive diagnostic test is a lumbar puncture and CSF examination. But we have a concern for an intracranial space occupying lesion, and hence we think that if we do a lumbar puncture, there can be a herniation and patient can deteriorate. Hence, we get a CT scan done before getting an LP. But there are conditions where CT scan can be done, an LP can be done even without a CT scan. If all the following conditions are met. The first is patient being conscious. No focal neurologic deficits. No immunocompromise. No papilledema. And the age is not in extremes of ages, usually less than 60 to 65 years of age. Okay? If all these conditions are met, you may go ahead and proceed to do an LP without a CT scan in a patient with suspected meningitis. Okay? Hence, this patient, which is conscious female, without any mention of immunocompromise or focal deficits, etc., may be considered for a direct LP without an urgent neuroimaging. However, new headache in an HIV positive male is usually, and usually raises a concern about an intracranial space occupying lesion, and if missed in the emergency department, may need later evaluation and delay in the initiation of therapy in such a patient on an outpatient basis. Hence, this becomes an indication for getting a emergent neuroimaging. Okay. We come to the next question, which is the following is true about alcohol withdrawal syndrome. Okay. So before discussing alcohol withdrawal syndrome, you guys need to understand alcohol related seizures. Okay, all the seizures associated or occurring in a patient who has been taking alcohol either recently or on a long-term basis are not alcohol withdrawal syndromes. Okay, there could be a wide differential. So first thing is to keep the differential wide. Okay, so there could be various reasons for developing seizures in an alcoholic patient. This could be, most importantly, traumatic brain injury. This could be because of hypoglycemia. This could be because of Wernicke's encephalopathy. This could be because of CNS infection. Alcoholics are prone to CNS infection, meningitis, meningoencephalitis, brain abscesses, etc. The patient may have a past epilepsy which was precipitated by an alcohol intake. This could be because of a co-ingestant with alcohol. Okay, this could be a toxicology related seizure. Okay. Another thing, the patient who is alcoholic may miss his drugs and they could be non-compliant to anti-epileptic drugs. These could be the various causes. Okay, another thing obviously can be alcohol withdrawal syndrome, seizures. So these could be various causes of alcohol related seizures. If we discuss about alcohol withdrawal syndrome, these are generalized tonic-clonic seizures occurring from 6 to 48 hours after last drink. Okay, usually they are multiple. They could be single, but usually they are multiple in number. If you see any focal seizures, that means you should always consider an alternative diagnosis and get an imaging done. Okay, so this is an important consideration. Are they benign alcohol withdrawal seizures? No, because a lot of them progress into delirium tremens, which is associated with high morbidity and mortality. Okay, so this is a serious condition, and alcohol withdrawal seizures can herald the development of delirium tremens. Okay, so now let's come back to the question. Is the following is true? Phenytoin is loading is indicated? No. Phenytoin is not indicated in alcohol withdrawal syndrome seizures. Benzodiazepines are the treatment of choice. Patient should always be admitted to the hospital? No. If the patient has no post-ictal confusion, after some hours of observation, the patient has single or 1 or 2 episodes of seizure with no recognizable alternative cause for the patient developing seizure, there is no significant trauma, and there are no other comorbidities, the patient can very well be discharged in a stable condition. Okay? The seizures can usually occur between 6 to 48 hours. That's correct. Seizures associated with alcohol are always benign. This is again wrong. Okay. So the correct answer is C. Okay. We come to the next question, which is the following substances is not adequately absorbed by activated charcoal. Activated charcoal is an important material used for GI decontamination. In patients with suspected toxicities and overdoses, but there are some toxins or materials which are not absorbed by activated charcoal, and you can remember them by the mnemonic AHIL. A stands for alcohols, toxic alcohols. H stands for hydrocarbons. I stands for iron, lithium, and lead. So these are the ones in which activated charcoal is not very helpful. Hence, iron is the correct answer. Okay. We come to the question number 71. A 30-year-old man presents with altered mental status, high-grade fever, and nuchal rigidity. You suspect bacterial meningitis. Which of the following is an appropriate order of your actions? So, this time we already know that the patient has a bacterial meningitis upfront based on the clinical examination itself, clinical examination and history itself. Okay. So now the next step of action is to diagnose and treat. One of the very important things in bacterial meningitis is an early antibiotic use. Okay. Early antibiotic therapy is very important, and this should not be delayed pending various investigations. Okay. Especially imaging or a lumbar puncture. If we're talking about lumbar puncture, blood culture, and head CT scan. Okay, head CT scan can wait, not a problem, because this is an interim step to get a lumbar puncture done, as we recently discussed about. Okay, so this can even be avoided in many cases if we satisfy a lot of situations and conditions. Lumbar puncture, okay, the CSF sterilizes only after 6 to 8 hours of antibiotic therapy. Initiating antibiotic. Okay, it takes 6 to 8 hours for CSF to sterilize. So there's no urgency to get a CSF done and withholding antibiotics for this long. Okay, for other things. So it's very easy or very safe, or rather recommended, to give antibiotic first, followed by getting an LP for CSF. Right? But one thing which can be done before antibiotic therapy is blood cultures. Because soon after giving antibiotics, the blood becomes sterile and the yield for blood cultures decreases a lot. Manifold, okay? So, blood culture is a priority, but this should not be, we should not wait to obtain a blood culture and withhold the antibiotics for a long time. Because antibiotics are important. Only if the blood culture, taking a blood culture is not delaying the antibiotic treatment, should we start antibiotic, should we take a blood culture before antibiotic? If we are getting delayed by in the process of taking blood culture, you may omit this and start away give antibiotics. Okay, so blood culture and antibiotics. Blood culture. So in all the options where there is lumbar puncture before antibiotics, they should be striked off. Lumbar puncture, no, this is okay. Lumbar puncture before antibiotics, it's not suitable. Lumbar puncture first, no. HCT, lumbar puncture, okay. So we are left with two options now, right? What is the role of steroids here? Now the steroids have been shown to decrease the permanent neurological sequelae, CNS sequelae, in some bacterial meningitis. For example, pneumococcus and Haemophilus influenzae, right? And since upfront we don't know about which kind of bacterial infection, bacterial meningitis is the patient having, thus we should consider steroids upfront in all patients with suspected bacterial meningitis. However, this recommendation is not very strong, as various evidence suggests that in low to middle income countries or in resource limited settings, the steroids are not very beneficial. Having said that, we still, depends from institution to institution, and steroids are still considered before antibiotic administration. And the steroids are useful only if given up to 20 minutes prior to antibiotics. They have no role after starting antibiotic therapy. Okay, so steroids should be before antibiotics. Steroids should be before antibiotics. Okay. Now, one should not wait for getting a HCT done and then start antibiotics so late. Okay, so the correct answer would be correct sequence is blood culture followed by steroids followed by antibiotics, then HCT and lumbar puncture. Why do we need a HCT here? Because the patient is having an altered mental status. Had the patient been conscious and had satisfied the previous criteria discussed, we could have gone ahead and done a lumbar puncture right away without a HCT, but not here. Okay. Now we come to another neurologic emergency. Which of the following feature favors conus medullaris over cauda equina? Okay, so both of these are neurosurgical emergencies. Let's discuss the differences between the two. So if this is the spinal cord, comes down, tapers off, this is the filum terminale, and these are the nerve roots which move out from various foramina. These are the vertebra as the cross section. Okay, so this part is called as the conus medullaris and is at the level of L1 to L2 vertebra. What does it have is the sacral nerve roots or ganglia. Okay, this portion below the conus looks like a horse tail and is called cauda equina. Okay, this usually has lumbar or the lumbosacral nerve roots. Okay, so this is a anatomical difference between conus medullaris and cauda equina. And if you understand this anatomical difference, you will be able to understand a lot of other differences as well. Okay, I'll change colors again. So, since this is a part of spinal cord, conus medullaris and cauda equina. Since this is a part of spinal cord, this causes upper motor neuron type pathology, and this causes element type abnormalities. Okay. However, since at this level we also see some nerve roots simultaneously, this could be a mixed human plus element type palsy as well. Okay. So conus medullaris, rather, if you see an upper motor neuron type paralysis, you always suspect conus medullaris and not cauda equina syndrome. Okay. As simple as that. Next thing, cauda equina is usually asymmetric. The presentation, clinical presentation is asymmetric. Okay, this usually is symmetric. This is a very small area, conus medullaris. Any pathology usually is big enough to cause a symmetric change, as compared to a diffuse area of cauda equina, where the pathology cannot involve the whole of the cauda equina simultaneously. Hence, it's usually asymmetric in presentation. Now, since conus medullaris has sacral nerve roots and ganglia involved, there is a high involvement of bladder, bowel, and sexual dysfunction. This is mild here. Okay, so this is significant, severe, and early. This is mild and delayed. Now, since cauda equina has lumbar nerve roots as well, okay, since it has lumbar nerve roots as well, this has higher lower limb involvement. Okay, in the form of muscle weakness, in the form of sensory weakness, sensory abnormalities rather. Okay, this has less pronounced lower limb involvement. Okay, next thing we discussed about upper motor neuron type. So, plantars are extensor, here they are flexor or absent. Okay, talking about another superficial reflex is bulbocavernosus reflex. Since this is a UMN type pathology, in conus medullaris, the bulbocavernosus reflex is spared or is present. In the cauda equina, bulbocavernosus reflex is absent. Deep tendon reflexes of the lower limbs are exaggerated because this is a human type palsy. So the knee jerk and the ankle jerk would be exaggerated in conus medullaris and would be decreased in cauda equina syndrome. So these are the various differences between conus medullaris and cauda equina syndrome. All are based on the anatomical description which we discussed here. Okay. So, which of the following features favors conus medullaris over cauda equina? Unilateral involvement? No, this is more suggestive of cauda equina. Sacral anesthesia? Okay. So, since the sacral nerve roots are involved in both these, the sacral anesthesia is a feature which is common to both conus medullaris and cauda equina. However, a more symmetric sacral involvement or sacral anesthesia will be seen in conus as compared to an asymmetric sacral anesthesia, which would be a feature of cauda equina syndrome. So this is an equivalent for both. Radicular pain. Okay, so more of the nerve roots are involved in cauda equina, right? And the cord itself is involved in conus medullaris. So radicular pain would be more of a feature of cauda equina over conus medullaris. So this is again suggestive of cauda equina. Upper motor neuron lesion is something which is suggestive of conus medullaris and not cauda equina syndrome. Okay. We come back to another named ECG signs. So you'll find this in the explanation as well. Explanation which will be provided to you as well. I'll try to show you some explanation by making some drawings. Okay, so which of the following signs is not associated with ventricular tachycardia? So now, why this question per se? So when we talk about wide complex tachycardia, wide complex means more than 3 small squares. When the QRS is more than 3 small square and there is tachycardia. Tachycardia means more than 100, generally speaking. There is a differential diagnosis of ventricular tachycardia or SVT with aberrancy. By aberrancy I mean there are some abnormalities in the conduction at the ventricular level, like a bundle branch block, like acidosis, etc., which can lead to widening of a normally narrow complex. So in easy terms I would say there could be a differential between SVT, which is wide, and a VT. Okay, so it's important to differentiate the two. So there are various things the various signs and various algorithms which are employed to differentiate between the VT and SVT if it is a regular wide complex tachycardia. Okay. Now what is Marriott sign? To discuss Marriott sign, we look at lead B1. Normally in right bundle branch block, there is a biphasic P wave, R wave in patients with RBBB. Okay. So this is called rabbit ear. It looks like rabbit ear. So if the left rabbit ear okay, I'll tell you with an example versus VT. This is the difference between the two. If the left rabbit ear is taller, it is suggestive of VT. If the right rabbit ear is taller, it is suggestive of RBBB pattern. This is called Marriott sign in lead B1. Okay. Now coming to the Brugada sign, with the predominantly negative QRS complexes, if the onset of QRS to the lowest point of the S wave, if this distance is more than 100 milliseconds, okay, more than 100 milliseconds, this is Brugada sign and is suggestive of VT. Right? What about Josephson sign? If you see in a negative QRS that there is a notch in the descending limb of the S wave. This notch is called Josephson sign. Again suggestive of VT. So Marriott, Brugada and Josephson all are suggestive of VT. So what is Spodek sign? Spodek sign is seen in acute pericarditis. We've discussed the ECGs of acute pericarditis previously, but I didn't tell you about the Spodek sign then. What this means is a downsloping TP segment, which means if the patient has right, so this is P QRS T with an ST elevation here. This segment, which is between the T and P wave, is a downsloping thing. This is Spodek sign and is suggestive of acute pericarditis. Okay, it is not related to VT or SVT at all. So the answer would be Spodek sign, C. Okay, we come to the next ECG question. We'll see the ECG first. Okay, so this is ECG which clearly says and shows that there are tall T waves here. Okay, very, very tall T waves. So the two things come to our mind when we see tall T waves. One is hyperkalemia and one is hyperacute T waves. Okay. Now how do we differentiate? I briefly mentioned these two. So the T wave of hyperkalemia is defined as tall, tented, symmetric. Okay, it looks something like this. This is a tall, tented, symmetric T wave of hyperkalemia. For hyperacute T wave in MI, it is usually asymmetric, bulky, and wide based. Okay, so this usually is something of this kind. Okay, so these are tall T waves, asymmetric with a wide base, bulky base. You can see, you can enlarge this ECG to some extent and see it. Bulky T waves. Okay, same everywhere. Bulky T waves. Right. So this is seen in. Okay, now we say that this is because of a pathology of ischemia. These are seen in anterior leads. These are hyperacute T waves in the anterior leads. These are suggestive of an LAD occlusion, an acute LAD occlusion, which is seen in option A, acute LAD occlusion. Now consider option B, tight LAD stenosis, which means that the LAD is not completely blocked, but there is a tight stenosis at the ostium or near the ostium or during the length of the left anterior descending. This is not equivalent to a complete LAD occlusion, and this leads to some other kind of a T wave which is called Wellens T waves. Just remember the name, you don't have to remember the morphology. It is just a biphasic T wave. Okay, the terminal part is negative on a T wave. This is P, QRS, T, which is biphasic. This is Wellens T wave pattern. Okay, this suggests tight LAD stenosis. Left main coronary artery occlusion we have discussed on the ECG. It causes ST elevation in AVR and nothing to do with hyperacute T waves. And hyperkalemia is a close differential which causes a different morphology of tall T waves. Okay. Now we come to the last question here, which is in a sense a basic question for approach to a chest pain. Okay. So a lot of patients present to the emergency department with a common complaint of chest pain. Now how do we come to understand that this chest pain is related to ischemia or pulmonary embolism or something else? One of the important thing which we can miss easily but which can cost the patient his life and a lot of morbidity can happen is missing an acute coronary syndrome. And so a lot of literature suggests and have studied the various descriptors of chest pain which can increase the likelihood of the chest pain being ischemic, and those descriptors which can decrease the likelihood of chest pain being ischemic. Okay. So the features which increase the likelihood are described as NERD. This is nausea, vomiting, the chest pain which increases on exertion, any radiation from jaw to umbilicus, presence of diaphoresis, which is excessive sweating, or dyspnea. Okay, if any one of them is present, it increases the likelihood ratio for the chest pain being because of acute coronary syndrome. There are things which decrease the likelihood ratio, and these are defined as, can be remembered as pipes. The P stands for pleuritic chest pain. Pleuritic chest pain typically is a sharp, localized chest pain which varies with breath or breathing or respiration, right? So pleuritic chest pain, inframammary location of chest pain. P again stands for pain which increases on palpation or which increases with change in position. Okay. E stands for not associated with exertion. And S stands for a sharp nature of pain. If any of these is present, these decrease the possibility of an acute coronary syndrome. However, any combination of these factors or any of these factors independently cannot be, taken into consideration to rule out ACS with 100% surety. You can never do that by any of the clinical features in the emergency department. Okay, but these are some of the guides which increase or decrease the likelihood ratio of patients with the chest pain. Okay, what are the factors which decrease the likelihood ratio? So jaw pain, no. Jaw to umbilicus pain, it increases. So this is not correct. Pain in the right arm, again, this is not correct because this increases the likelihood ratio of chest pain being ischemic. Okay, mild chest pain. Okay, the severity has not to do much with the likelihood ratio because, however, usually the ischemic chest pain is felt as severe chest pain, moderate to severe. However, many patients present with mild chest pain who turn out to be of ischemic origin. Hence, this should not be used as a differentiating marker. A pain which increases in palpation and changing posture, yes, this is the correct answer. And this is something which decreases the likelihood ratio for an ischemic cardiac chest pain. Okay, so here we come to an end of the 75 questions of basics of emergency medicine and some topics which I feel would be important for the PG aspirants in their PG entrance examinations and are high yield questions, especially for those who are targeting AIIMS for PG entrance. Okay, in case you need any further help or clarification in any of the questions, you can drop a mail to me. This is my email address. Okay, feel free to talk to me about any of these queries. I am Dr. Naman Agrawal. Thank you.